The blood spread across the marble floor like spilled wine, dark and thick in the flickering lamplight of the cryptoporticus. 30 wounds. Not an execution, but an exorcism. Each thrust of the blade sought to destroy not just the man, but the terrible idea he had become. In the hidden passageways beneath his own palace, in the bowels of absolute power, the living god, Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, met a very human end. He was 28 years old. He had ruled Rome for less than 4 years. But in that brief nightmarish span, the mistress of the world held its breath as hope curdled into disbelief, and disbelief twisted into paralyzing terror. The question that haunts history isn't who killed him. The real question, the one that chilled the blood of senators and guards alike as they watched him fall, was why they waited so long. To understand the magnitude of what happened on that January day in 41 AD, you must first understand what Rome had become. This was no longer the Republic of Cicero and Caesar. That system had died screaming in the civil wars, its corpse propped up by Augustus and his genius for political theater. For nearly 60 years, Rome had lived under an illusion, a carefully maintained fiction that the Republic still breathed while an emperor's hand controlled every lever of power. Augustus had ruled with wisdom, Tiberius with cold efficiency. But when the throne passed to a 24-year-old who had spent his childhood in military camps, surrounded by soldiers who mockingly called him little boots, everything Augustus had built began to crack and bleed. The year was 37 AD. Rome stretched from the mists of Britain to the deserts of the Euphrates, an empire of 50 million souls whose fates were decided by one man sitting on the Palatine Hill. The legions stood watch on distant frontiers, 28 legions of professional killers numbering over 150,000 men. The capital itself had swollen to more than 1 million inhabitants, a sprawling organism of marble temples and festering slums, of unimaginable wealth and crushing poverty existing side by side in an obscene marriage. In the wealthy districts, villas sprawled across manicured hills, their gardens perfumed with imported roses, their pools stocked with exotic fish, their households attended by hundreds of slaves whose lives were worth less than the silverware they polished. But in the narrow alleys of the Subura where sunlight never penetrated, Rome's poor lived stacked like cargo in apartment buildings that rose 7 and 8 stories high, their walls so thin that a neighbor's whisper could wake an entire floor, their timbers so dry that fire consumed them with terrifying regularity. Into this world of extremes stepped Caligula, a young man who had never known anything but worship and deference. He was the son of Germanicus, the legendary general who had avenged Rome's greatest military disaster. He was the grandson of Augustus himself. The blood of gods flowed through his veins, and at first, Rome loved him for it. His early acts seemed to herald a golden age. He abolished the treason trials that had terrorized the aristocracy under Tiberius, releasing prisoners who had languished in dungeons for years. He distributed lavish bonuses to the Praetorian Guard and the urban masses, emptying the treasury in spectacular displays of generosity. The games he organized made Augustus look modest by comparison, gladiatorial contests that stretched for days, exotic animals imported from the farthest reaches of Africa, naval battles staged in artificial lakes with full-scale warships and crews of condemned men fighting to the death. The young emperor seemed to understand that power's greatest strength lay not in fear, but in love. He made himself accessible in ways that Tiberius never had, appearing in public, listening to petitions, showing genuine interest in the concerns of ordinary Romans. He embodied the promise of a new generation, young and energetic, connected to both the divine authority of his lineage and the human needs of his subjects. But there is something about absolute power that strips away humanity like flesh from bone. Day by day, decision by decision, the throne itself transforms whoever sits upon it. The process is so gradual that neither the ruler nor the ruled notice it happening until the transformation is complete and irreversible. If you're drawn to these dark corners of history, to the moments where civilization teetered on the edge of madness, consider subscribing. This community stretches across continents, united by a fascination with the terrible truths that shaped our world. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because these stories belong to all of us. The transformation began with what seemed like harmless extravagance. Caligula spent money like water, depleting the treasury Augustus had carefully filled through decades of efficient administration. He built bridges across the Bay of Naples just so he could ride across them wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate, which he had plundered from the conqueror's tomb in Alexandria. 3 miles of pontoon bridges supported by hundreds of ships, all for one man's theatrical fantasy. The cost was astronomical, but the spectacle was unforgettable. He staged gladiatorial contests where the death toll climbed into the hundreds, elaborate dramas with exotic costumes and sets that transported audiences to mythical worlds where gods battled monsters and heroes faced impossible odds. Then came the illness. A terrible fever struck him in his 8th month of rule, and for days he lay unconscious while the empire held its breath. Temples filled with worshippers begging the gods to spare their beloved emperor. Sacrifices were offered on a scale not seen since Rome's founding. The people genuinely loved him, and their prayers seemed to be answered when the fever finally broke. But the man who rose from that sickbed was no longer the same. Something fundamental had shifted during those dark days of delirium. whether from brain damage, psychological collapse, or simply the moment when his worst impulses finally devoured his better nature. What emerged was a distorted version of his former self, a nightmare dressed in imperial purple. And what he unleashed was something that had always lurked within the system Augustus created, waiting for the right monster to set it free. The first symptom was blood, an insatiable thirst for it. Caligula reopened the treason trials with a vengeance that made Tiberius look merciful by comparison. But these weren't trials in any meaningful sense. They were theatre macabre performances where guilt was predetermined and innocence was irrelevant. The accusations were absurd by any rational standard. Men were condemned for failing to swear by his genius with sufficient enthusiasm. Others were executed for neglecting to sacrifice to his divine image before conducting business. Some were killed for the crime of appearing in his dreams in a disrespectful manner. The definition of treason expanded to include any action, word, or even thought that displeased the emperor. Marcus Junius Silenus, a respected senator and former consul, was executed for expressing mild criticism of the emperor's spending policies. His trial lasted less than an hour. His body was disposed of before it was cold, and his property was confiscated immediately. His family was forbidden to mourn him publicly, and his name was ordered erased from every public record, as if he had never existed. Gaius Ascribinus Curio, whose family had served Rome for generations, was executed for owning a house that Caligula wanted for one of his building projects. When Curio refused to sell at the price offered, he was charged with treason for obstructing imperial will. His execution was public, his family exiled, and the house was demolished rather than occupied because the emperor had simply wanted to destroy it for amusement. The financial motivation was nakedly obvious. Caligula's spectacular spending had drained the treasury, and confiscated estates provided a quick way to refill it. The wealthy discovered that their riches made them targets rather than protectors. At funerals, the emperor would appear, weep publicly for the deceased, then announce that the best way to honor their memory was to confiscate their entire estate for his divine use. But it wasn't just about money. Caligula derived genuine pleasure from humiliation, from the psychological destruction of the most powerful people in the world. He forced elderly senators to run for miles beside his litter during the brutal summer heat, their purple-striped togas streaming behind them as they gasped for breath and stumbled on cobblestones. These weren't young men. Many were in their 60s and 70s, their bodies worn down by years of comfortable living. Sonador Pomponius Secundus, a man who had commanded legions in Germania and Britain, was forced to act as Caligula's personal herald, standing in the forum to announce the emperor's pronouncements to crowds who remembered when Secundus had been one of Rome's most respected leaders. Marcus Lepidus, who was married to Caligula's own sister Drusilla, had to publicly thank the emperor for the privilege of sharing his wife with him at state banquets, standing before assembled guests to express his gratitude that the divine emperor had chosen to honor his marriage bed. These humiliations were calculated psychological warfare, designed not just to punish individuals but to teach the entire ruling class their new place in the world. Every senator who watched a colleague's degradation understood that his turn might come next. Fear became the air that Rome breathed, thick and paralyzing, seeping into every corner of society. No one was safe. Senators checked their words even in private conversations with their closest friends. Slaves reported on their masters in exchange for freedom or to avoid punishment. Children informed on their parents when imperial agents promised rewards for loyalty to the emperor above family. The bonds that held civilization together began to dissolve under the corrosive influence of universal suspicion. But terror wasn't enough for Caligula. As his power became more absolute, his appetites grew more grotesque. He declared himself a living god, the equal of Jupiter himself, worthy of the same reverence Romans had offered to the immortals for 8 centuries. This wasn't mere megalomania. It was the logical extension of the imperial system taken to its ultimate, horrifying conclusion. He ordered the heads torn from statues of the most venerated deities throughout the empire and replaced with his own face. In temples across the Mediterranean world, Jupiter, Mars, Apollo, and Minerva suddenly bore the features of a 26-year-old man with a cruel smile. The psychological impact was devastating. These weren't just political changes but attacks on the fundamental structure of reality as Romans understood it. The gods had been constants, sources of comfort that transcended the rise and fall of rulers. To see those divine faces replaced with the emperors was to watch the sacred order collapse. In Alexandria, riots erupted when officials attempted to replace the head of a statue of Serapis. Roman troops suppressed the unrest, and hundreds died defending temples that had stood for centuries. In Athens, scholars who had spent their lives contemplating the nature of divinity found themselves required to pray to a living man who embodied everything their teachings said a god should not be. But perhaps Caligula's most ambitious blasphemy was his attempt to relocate the statue of Zeus at Olympia, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. From Greece to his palace in Rome, the statue stood 40 feet tall and was considered the most perfect representation of divine majesty ever created. Moving it would require engineering on an impossible scale, but more than that, it would symbolize the final triumph of his divinity over the old gods themselves. In the streets, ordinary citizens whispered that demons had possessed their emperor. that the gods had abandoned Rome, that the end times had finally arrived. Temples were crowded with desperate worshippers begging to be made invisible to imperial notice. Prayer became a survival strategy. The empire that had conquered the known world now cowered before the monster it had created, trapped in a nightmare with no apparent end. Until that day in January, in the darkness of the Cryptoporticus, when 30 blades finally answered the question that had haunted Rome for 4 years, not who would stop him, but when, and whether Rome itself could survive what he had revealed about the true nature of absolute power.